We are one game away from NFL Week 12 being in the books, a crucial week of the NFL season. All the weeks are crucial, but we're into a point where wins and losses truly matter, especially if you're in the contest of the FFPC Main Event, for example. Each and every single point in that instance will matter, with the two highest record teams and the two highest points total teams advancing to the playoffs starting next week. So we're right down into that crucial period, Shawn. We talked about it before we started. There are some games that you're involved that are trying to craft through certain windows that may not even be humanly possible to see if teams advance, between having players you need to score points in one league versus having points you need them not to score in another league. So it's going to be interesting to see how Monday Night Football plays out. Then we are into the playoffs over there at the main event. And of course, with people's dynasty leagues, redraft leagues, and so on, we are heading into that particular portion of the season. And then we get into the best ball tournament stretch that will be coming up in 3 weeks' time. So very exciting time here in the fantasy football calendar. I, for one, Shawn, was not as excited at certain points of NFL Week 12. It felt like this week was going pretty slow in that opening slit, but it also has to factor in, we did have Thursday games, we had the Friday game, we had a lot of talented players playing in those games. So that meant that there wasn't as much of an opportunity in that particularly early slate of games for those stars to be there. But looking back at how things have played out over the course of the week and watching the games, there is a lot to be excited about, a lot to talk about. How are you feeling, Shawn, about NFL Week 12, outside of the fact that you are trying to do some quantum physics here to try and win some matches to advance to the playoffs?
Yeah, I mean, if you have been watching the new Bodies show on Netflix and believe in time travel, then there are some plays.
Oh my gosh.
Or you just believe in time
Shawn,
travel.
something is happening on the podcast that I can talk to my wife about. There's something happening on the podcast that I can cross-reference here. We've watched the show.
Very good. Very good. Yeah, I have not quite finished. It's a show that's simultaneously ridiculous, occasionally bland, but also plotted in a fun way. And Colm, many times that's all we can ask for. I am enjoying the characters, even if some of the scenes could use a little bit of extra punch. But again, time travel. Can we put you and your wife into the love time travel shows, Colm?
I don't think so. Shawn has not seen the end of this show, but he has successfully already shared my review for anyone that's interested.
I mean, I'm hoping that the end delivers a big punch, Colm, but we'll see. Yesterday was crazy and so much fun. And Colm, it's definitely the week that I have been the most physically, emotionally involved in for a long time. And that only makes sense. This is the week where you get into the tournament. There was a missed 58-yard kick by the Colts kicker there. Player we were deploying a lot of different places. There was a missed 55-yard field goal by Brandon McManus. Now, again, on Brandon McManus, you can't complain that much. He did put up 15 points, which is more than you're looking for or expecting from your kicker. Colm, Week 12 is probably the only week, and I say that, but then next week's the semis, the week after that, the finals, then we have the race. If we're in the mix in Week 17, there will be some field goals that are being rooted very hard for. But Week 12 was
against, depending on which way you're.
Well, and this is the thing, is that I was talking with Ben on Stealing Bananas last night, and we were celebrating the magnificent kick from Jake Elliott, in part because Ben and I do have him going on a team, and in part because it was worth celebrating. One of the all-time great kicks. You're excited to, have watched it. You're excited for him. I mean, we talk about it pretty frequently, but it's worth reiterating. These are real people who are having things happen in their own lives that are magical. And so that I thought was really, really cool. It's weird to say that a field goal was the highlight of Week 12, but I really do believe that it was. It was just a magnificent play. Then I go and check later, and I do think that Blair and I on our main event are going to miss the playoffs because of that kick. And so you're like, well, you win some, you lose some. It's hard to keep track of 8 different main events and all the permutations, because in Week 12, you're not just playing against your opponent. You're playing against basically 4 or 5 different teams that you're competing with for the points to get in. And now to get in, we need the Minnesota Vikings defense to score 1 or 0 points. There is one other permutation, but Colm, you and I were joking before the show. People are asking, has Justin Fields ever started an NFL game in which the opposing defense scored 1 or 0 points? The answer would be no. And that's probably not a shock to anybody. Now, he does have a game without a sack, and that might be surprising in and of itself. He did throw 2 picks in that game, which also obviously gets you over the threshold. He actually does have a couple of games with 1 sack, but those games also have, and those are further back. The unleashed version of Justin Fields is getting sacked much more often as they try to deploy his legs in the running game. Those games also did feature interception. So again, he hasn't hit the mark yet, but Colm, that's what week 12 is for, to do things you haven't done, which is the Chicago Bears holding the opposing defense to 1 or 0 fantasy points. Colm, you and I are in a very exciting point with our team. We look like we could get the sweep, which would be finishing with most points and best record. We still have some work to do there. Colm, I think the hardest thing this week was making some of those QB decisions. And I've referenced that on several occasions. Sam Howell, Brock Purdy, Tua, and Joshua Dobbs all in the mix. Now, the funny thing on our Chasing Stolen Bananas team was that we were really trying to decide between Purdy and Tua. Both of those players bust. And the third QB that I kind of just fit in there to give some additional flexibility for like week 17 and or to perhaps block one of the other teams in our league. I had Jordan Love a week or so ago for 1 point. He would have put that team in much better position to where we're not sweating the Monday night game quite so much in order to get the most points in that league. But you and I, we had to decide between Joshua Dobbs and Jared Goff. Blair and I had to decide between Jared Goff and Tua. That was the only game in which I didn't bench Tua this weekend. And again, it does look like it will cost us making the playoffs. So that is disappointing. Tua played pretty well. I mean, it's a weird game there where Jalen Waddle has one of his better performances of the entire season. Tyreek Hill goes off again, and yet Tua's fantasy scoring doesn't work. And that's the other tiny little element in their preseason that had pushed him down into the great value range, which is not just the concussion risk, which hasn't played out, but this individual game path where he can actually get both of those receivers involved, but because they have nobody else and because he doesn't run, you end up with that type of game. Tua's game was an absolute killer. Colm, explain where we were going with Joshua Dobbs and what that means for us as we try and get the sweep.
Well, before we get into that, Shawn, it felt like when you were talking through those scenarios with Justin Fields, there was 2 things come into my head. One was from Arrested Development, where you're kind of saying it didn't work for those people or those defenses or those offenses, but it may work for us. The other part was, so you're saying there's a chance, but feels like your best path in some of those situations may be to figure out the time travel and be able to move things around, and that might be the best option. But for us, Shawn,
and get. I mean, Colm, this is the one that, in addition to field goals, which obviously no listeners care about or want to hear about, Travis Etienne.
Oh, we're going to get to that, Shawn.
Stuffed at the goal line. Okay, we'll get there later.
Spoiler alert.
There was some fury, some sadness. And Colm, we're experiencing this just like everyone else, which is, it was tough. It was tough. What's our situation here? Did we go with Jared Goff? Are we locked in? Or did we go with Joshua Dobbs and we have to, I say sweat out, but the excitement. If you go with Jared Goff, then nothing to root for tonight.
Yeah, you'd also have won the game comfortably and have 24.5 more points in our lineup. So that is our answer. We went with Dobbs, and I'll be honest, most weeks it's me that is in the Jared Goff corners, and we got to go all in on the Lions, because this is a team that also has Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta. But I did mention on the show that came out on Friday, but was recorded on Thursday, that the Packers had struggled against the run quite a bit. So I did have concerns that we could see, similar to what happened with Tua that you were talking about, could have happened here to Jared Goff. And they struggled throughout this game. Goff struggled throughout this game, but he then went ahead and got some late scores to put up that particular total. So we have Joshua Dobbs in our lineup rather than Goff, and that 24.5 points, Shawn, would have really set us up with a strong chance for that sweep in terms of finishing as the top points team. The team that is going against us to finish there is a Hawkinson team with Joseph, the kicker for the Vikings, as their kicker versus us with Dobbs. So there is some correlation there as well. It might be a case that they don't punch it in for a touchdown, and next thing we get a field goal for Joseph. And there's a lot of different scenarios that we'll be rooting, hoping it goes in our favor there. But as things stand, a very, very close edge. I think I would rather probably be on the Hawkinson side, but the advantage is that we have points on the board, and that is part of, I think, something that you would like to see there. You mentioned being able to see the upside, and there is weeks where you feel like, oh, I should have started that player, and next thing, Dobbs has 2 rushing touchdowns tonight and puts up a 30-point game, gives you 6 extra points. That's the difference making in the sweep. So we'll see what happens there, but we are set up very strongly in terms of that total wins for the record. So we are hoping to win this week, which would give us that based on our points as a tiebreaker. To do that, we need 3.85 points from Dobbs. So for the listeners out there who want to root along on Monday Night Football, we need at least 3.85 points. I think we should be able to do that, but I'm also worried that.
Well, Colm, I've had early injuries benefit me, and I mean, I once won an FFPC championship game, 82-81, where my opponent's tight end was injured early on Monday Night Football. So
you're saying that karma's coming back to get us here?
Well, no, just, I mean, you want to be aware that things can happen, and not count your chickens, but also just, emotionally be ready for all the twists and turns that could happen. You mentioned that Detroit Lions game. And one of the things that did happen there is that both David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs ran effectively, and yet effectively in a way that still appeared, to me at least, to hurt the Lions. Now, I've got Montgomery and Gibbs on lots of teams, so it's not just, merely rooting for certain fantasy outcomes. But Colm, because of the turnovers early, they get down 23-6, and the drive before that as well, when they're down 20-6 early. Now, I mean, it's 2 touchdowns. When you're at home, there's so much of the game to still go, but you run a very weak drive where you're handing the ball off. There were so many situations in this game where the Lions missed out on a chance to be explosive offensively because they were trying to, number one, prove that they were going to dominate the line of scrimmage and that they were going to win that battle. The matchups suggested they were going to win in the running game, where they had the elite running game. The Packers struggled to stop it. So you're trying to put your stamp on this. You're trying to win the macho battle there, and yet you have to understand the game conditions. And you look at this and you look at the frantic comeback where Jared Goff ends up throwing 44 times. He ends up throwing for over 330 yards. He only takes the 3 sacks. You have Amon-Ra, again, with a very solid game. You have them when they're kind of looking for a little bit of a spark, and the defense is obviously trying to take away Amon-Ra and Sam Laporta, who had a very nice game himself, in part because he scores that touchdown. They're able to get Khalif Raymond involved. He goes for 90 yards. It's another game where Jameson Williams makes a couple of big plays that spark them. So they have the pieces there, and Goff is able to rally them. But because they burned so much time early, they're not able to come through and get the win. That's the main concern I have with a team that does have so much rushing firepower, is that sometimes they're going to use that to their detriment. It was a fantastic game by Jordan Love. It was a fantastic game for Christian Watson, who needed to show that he could be in that group of young star wide receivers making the push. We were talking about what Jaden Reed and Romeo Doubs and even Dontavian Wicks were doing for this roster. To see Watson do it on such a big stage, the Packers have to be ecstatic. Despite being 5-6, they are in the mix. They are coming on, very fast, similar, I think, to the Denver Broncos on the AFC side. It would not surprise me if they factor into the equation, not just to make the playoffs, but as a potential upset play in the playoffs, you're going to have to take this Green Bay Packers team seriously. Certainly not saying that Detroit wasn't doing that. Detroit, as a team that has played on Thanksgiving and lost on Thanksgiving consistently, one of the things that really stood out here was how loud the crowd was in this game and how desperate they were to finally show that they were the power team now. They were the Super Bowl contenders, that they had moved past the Green Bay Packers. This is a pretty devastating loss for the Lions. Now, it's not one that's probably going to set them back, although to play another bad game after they barely eke out a victory against the Chicago Bears, that's disconcerting. But from a psychological perspective, Dan Campbell's such a great coach that they're going to use this as fuel. They're going to come back stronger, but certainly a huge disappointment for them and their fan base.
Yeah, it has to be a disappointment, but based on the season, they're 8-3. I'm sure they're still, when they take stock of everything, they'll be still pretty pleased with that. But in terms of how this game happened, Shawn, a couple of just quick notes before we move into the Sunday action is the Packers get 20 first quarter points, and they do a couple of things here that we don't see that often in the NFL anymore. They, everyone knows of the advantage of trying to score before the half and getting the ball to start the second half. The Packers take the ball to start this game, maybe because they know the Lions, are a high-powered offense. They go straight with the first play of the game, a 53-yard completion to Christian Watson, which reminded me a little bit of, as a rookie, Christian Watson in the first game of the season. Aaron Rodgers takes a deep shot against the Vikings in Minnesota, has basically a 75-yard touchdown for his first catch and drops the ball at that particular point. And it did play up until this breakout at the second half of his rookie year, kind of seemed to play on his mind for a long, long time. But they started off, they get the touchdown in the opening drive. Jared Goff, who has those numbers at the end of the game, has 3 fumbles, all 3 of them lost in this game. So it kind of gets out of hand, but that first quarter really dictated where this game was going to go. But Jordan Love, we've mentioned him a couple of times over the last couple of weeks, is starting to play some very interesting football at the quarterback position in terms of his passing, in terms of how he's setting these players up. And I've mentioned it a number of times that pretty much all of this team, outside of A.J. Dillon, who played this week, are, first and second year players. So it's interesting to see where the Packers are moving to at this point. Shawn, we're going to move on to the Sunday games, and I don't think we can let the tease lie any longer. You were starting to talk about Travis Etienne. Did he get into the end zone?
Call up Travis Etienne never goes anywhere. Never goes anywhere. I had an interesting trade offer where I'm trying to pick up Breece Hall, and we were going back and forth, and the opposing manager wanted Etienne and McBride for Hall. And it was tough because I think there's a really strong chance that 5 years from now, we are talking about Breece Hall as a generational player, as a player who has separated from guys like Bijan Robinson and Jonathan Taylor. And that's not to say that I think those players are not going to also be fantastic. I mean, Breece Hall could be a combination of Adrian Peterson and Priest Holmes. So probably should have done the trade. But Travis Etienne, for all of the reasons we've discussed from the very beginning of the season through this current week, someone I don't want to give up on in the midst of this stretch where he's just getting slammed into the line. He came into, the reason why a Breece Hall manager would want Travis Etienne is that his scoring has been very good. His workload is encouraging in a lot of ways, even though the EP portion of the profile is actually a little bit disconcerting. You work through all of that. You know what Etienne did in college. You know the speed that he brings to the table. You look at the fact here that he has carved out a very clear moat around his touches. Now, he did appear to get shaken up a little bit in this game, and so you have kind of your heart in your throat there as you're trying to discover what that's going to mean. But the good news here is that it seemed to put him in position to get more high-value touches as the game went along and replace a few of those low-value touches with D'Ernest Johnson. It's going to happen, right? But when they make that great play to get the ball down to the 1 yard line with one play remaining in the first half, and you see that they have the guts to go ahead and go as opposed to kick a field goal there, you know that that is going to be a Travis Etienne play. You see the pitch, and you're thinking to yourself, they didn't just slam him into the line. But Colm, for the reasons that you've mentioned to me, still not exactly the type of creative and successful play calling that we need to fully unlock what Travis Etienne should bring to the table.
No, and we've talked about it, and I guess the Jaguars offense in general with some frustration over the last probably 8 weeks. Since the time in London was where it was kind of hitting its peak form, even though we had some of his bigger games, and that's a couple of London game stretch, very frustrating. So in this particular play that you're mentioning, I was pleased, Shawn, with the aggressive nature. They get a big play down the line to Christian Kirk, steps out of bounds. There's 1 second left. Do they kick a field goal? They obviously thought, well, we've really got a little bit of good fortune here. Let's try and punch it in for 7. When they go for this play, the other interesting thing is they start off in shotgun. They switch it to under center very, very quickly, which I kind of like that part of the play. But I just think the toss to the right-hand side and the way they executed this was, I think if you're doing this at the high school level, it's probably pretty basic. And in terms of over the course of Sunday's games, you see a lot of quarterbacks changing the play. And sometimes that's as simple. We've seen Russell Wilson have a really nice play today or on Sunday when he switches the running backs basically from his left-hand side to his right-hand side, 2 running backs in the formation. He fakes it basically to both of them, and he scrambles for a long rush on his own. All they need to do in this is switch the side that Etienne's on. There's defensive backs to the right-hand side as Lawrence looks at it. He basically tosses the ball to Etienne, who then has 2 free defensive backs to make the tackle on him at the 1 yard line. So he does not get in, Shawn, was the answer to my question. But
I thought get in the second half on his goal line carry.
The answer again would be a no. He does not make it in. He averages 2.8 yards per carry in this contest, has 20 carries. And the one positive is that has that backfield as his at this particular point in time. Also has 6 targets for 4 receptions, 30 yards. But Shawn, his longest rush in this game was a 20-yard rush. He has 20 carries for 56 yards. If you're doing the maths, that means he had 19 carries for 36 yards. That's not a good.
Well, he was at 10 carries for 10 yards at one point. He did have the long run, as you mentioned. He looked like he was about to break it as the Jaguars are trying to close out this game and the Texans are getting a little bit more desperate. I think if we had had another 5 carries, he's going to take one the distance. Obviously, the game runs out before you get to that point. And this is another game where, as a fantasy manager, you love the workload, but probably 26 opportunities is too many, especially for a back who has been shaken up, especially for a back who has some injury history, especially for a back who, Travis Etienne is not a small back, but he's also not, a hulking behemoth. It would be nice, again, to really focus on the high value touches with Etienne. I've been writing in the various articles that he needs to be used as an Austin Eckler or Alvin Kamara type. We saw that in college. When he gets into space, he's incredibly dynamic. He's a plus receiver. This is going to be a little bit of a redundant refrain from the two of us as we talk about the Jaguars. But when you evaluate the team here, a lot of it comes down to how good you actually think the individual pieces are. Because if you believe in Trevor Lawrence and you believe in Travis Etienne, and then you kind of look down the roster and you think about what they were able to do last year with Christian Kirk, Zay Jones, and Evan Ingram, and then you added Calvin Ridley. And fading Calvin Ridley was, especially at his price, was one of the strong calls that we made to help listeners out early. And yet I don't necessarily know that the part of the thesis that we were looking at is really even correct. I think that what's happened here is that Doug Peterson is calling a very bland and counterproductive game plan that is neutralizing the weapons that they have. This team should not be having to lean on its defense. Now, you do go out and you have a pretty successful game overall offensively. It's important to give credit where it's due, which is that Trevor Lawrence did get to 364 yards in this game. He did average almost 10 yards per attempt. You have one of those really strong games from Calvin Ridley that has seemingly come about once a month. Calvin Ridley,
Zay Jones is active. If we get Zay Jones active, we get Calvin Ridley unlocked.
You have really been noting that, and even though Zay Jones only catches one of his 3 targets, the one catch he does make in this game is a heroic catch. So that part, vaguely interesting. You continue to get volume for Evan Ingram, but not the kind of efficiency they necessarily need. This is an interesting one, Colm. Ben and I discussed last night whether or not Sean McDermott should be held accountable for some of the struggles the Bills have had. What would happen to the Bills if they made a move? What Sean McDermott would do later with a second team? I think all of those questions are pretty interesting. It doesn't seem to me like Peterson is in nearly that kind of trouble with the Jaguars when you think of them being 8-3. They're undefeated on the road. And yet you look at this and it really seems like this is the kind of roster where if they made the move to a young, innovative, play-calling head coach, that suddenly you're looking at the Jaguars being in the mix to win a Super Bowl for a decade. And right now they still seem very separated from teams like the Ravens and the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, maybe that's not the case. They do obviously have the loss to the Chiefs. They are tied in record with Kansas City and Baltimore. Would you put them down? And one of the things here is that all 3 of those teams are very interesting on both sides of the ball. The Ravens obviously dominate the Chargers on Sunday Night Football. The Chiefs have their big bounce back game, which we'll discuss in a moment. Those 2 teams, very dynamic on defense, although the Chiefs don't make big plays there against the Raiders. The Jaguars have been a revelation on defense. And in some ways, that makes it even harder to watch what they're doing offensively because there's actually a bit of an opening with the Bills struggling and the Bengals having those injuries, with 2 of the 3 power teams more or less being out. Although we can still expect the Bills to make some noise. The Ravens jump up to fill some of that vacuum. But if the Jaguars' offense were working, this would be an opportunity with the Chiefs' offense down and those other 2 teams out to sneak through, make a Super Bowl. And then, I think we've seen the weaker team win the Super Bowl quite frequently recently. And I think you could even make the case that the Eagles were better than the Chiefs last year. And that's coming from somebody currently wearing a Patrick Mahomes GOAT shirt. You get into that Super Bowl, anything could happen. Are we going to see the next step here? Are we going to see, Calvin Ridley has the big game. Christian Kirk makes some very impressive catches. Both of those guys go for 89 yards. You got Trevor Lawrence at any given moment. That talent seems like it could catch fire, and suddenly the Jaguars are going scorched earth on the AFC. I'm myself a little bit fired up just thinking about this. Are we going to get some huge Travis Etienne games down the stretch as the Jaguars cement themselves as the AFC power team, the AFC favorites for 2023?
We should, but I think my theme this season with the Jaguars has always been that there's meat being left on the bone. There's, plays being left out there. The play calling isn't as creative as it should be. It isn't as efficient as it should be. And there's, we just look through this here. So you mentioned the overall stats, but we have Calvin Ridley with a 45-yard reception. We have Christian Kirk with a 57-yard reception that set up that play that we mentioned at the 1-yard line. Luke Farrell is a 42-yard reception. Dearness Johnson is a 42-yard reception, which is a screen pass that he takes 42 yards. But there's so much explosive plays and players in this offense. I think if we look at this versus the Chiefs, obviously you have Patrick Mahomes, who you would take over Trevor Lawrence, and you have Travis Kelce, who you would take over Evan Ingram. But I think this, in terms of talent, is probably a more talented offense player for player outside of those 2 guys. And I think they're just being held back by the play calling. So I am still optimistic of big games down the stretch, but I also think that it's a little bit conservative. And I do think what you mentioned, this team could still win a Super Bowl, Shawn. I don't think that's out of the range of possibilities. But I also think that a little bit like we talk with the Falcons, the floor games or playing down to opposition is still going to be a problem, I think, for the Jaguars and some contests. Not putting them in that same category, but there's some of the same issues around using the players in the best way possible. The other side of this, Shawn, is the field goal
Colm,
at the end almost push it to overtime with the Texans. We do have CJ Stroud with another 300-yard game, 304, 2 touchdowns for him, but does have 4 sacks for 43 yards in this contest, has 47 rushing yards on 6 attempts, 1 touchdown with that. We get nothing else from the running game outside of him. Singletary and Pierce don't get a lot going on the ground, but we have Singletary as the second leading reception, 6 receptions, 54 yards. But Shawn, you mentioned a couple of weeks ago that Tank Dell might be somebody who could potentially push himself towards, second, third, fourth round range of next year's fantasy football drafts. He goes 5 for 50 and 1 touchdown in this. But Nico Collins, again, 7 for 104 and 1 touchdown on 9 receptions. I continue to be extremely impressed. And this was a game where the Houston Texans were very close to bringing this one to overtime as well.
They look fantastic. I think because of those splash plays that you mentioned for the Jaguars and the contrast between those splash plays and everything else that they did, this game felt like it was controlled by the Texans, even though it very clearly was not. And I think that you have to give the Jaguars defense a lot of credit in this one. Those 11 carries that you get for Singletary and Pierce combined really hurt this Texans offense because they were so inefficient. You mentioned Tank Dell. He was fantastic again on his 8 targets, also has a carry in there for 12 yards. Another nice game for Nico Collins. Similar to the situation with Noah Brown, it'll be interesting to watch how this develops because Collins is kind of that big-bodied athlete who's probably a great complement to what Tank Dell does, but visually, he looks like he's struggling out there. Now, he may not be 100% either health-wise, but if they can add some firepower around Tank Dell, you're talking about the Texans being able to control games through the air, again, for the next 15 years. Very, very exciting time to be a Houston Texans fan. It'll be interesting to see, too, if they really feel like they found something in Devin Singletary. He struggled on the ground in this game, and yet that complementary hybrid skill set that we talk about in running backs is so valuable in reality as well, because even though he was stuffed on the ground, so dynamic in the receiving game, including a 33-yard reception, to have that out there really changes their offense from early in the season when they were leaning on a Damian Pierce. Colm, as we kind of wrap up our discussion of the Jaguars, I did want to mention Blair's fantastic wrong read piece. This is a game in which, in case it feels like we're overstating where the Jags are with this running game. They carried 30 times in total. D'Ernest Johnson also really struggled. Tank Bigsby just gets the 1 carry, so you get a sense of where he's kind of fallen in the pecking order there. But 30 carries, only the 81 yards, average 2.7 yards per carry on the ground. And again, it's not like that's on low volume like it was with the Texans. That's on 30 carries. And only 2 of those come from Trevor Lawrence. So it's not like you're getting a bunch of additional QB rush attempts in there. You go back to Blair's preview of this game, and we're talking about a Jaguars rushing offense. And again, a rushing offense with Travis Etienne doing almost all of the work. And it's certainly fair to be skeptical of Etienne. If you don't believe in him, then you have some evidence in your favor on that. So I'm not saying that that's impossible. I would encourage any listener who didn't see it and is interested to go back and read kind of the preseason Travis Etienne article talking about why he had just, such elite upside based on what he's done in the past, his actual production, his skill set, those types of things. So I would argue that, he's probably not the problem, but it's been a problem. Colm, we're talking about a team here that ranks 28th overall in EPA per rush attempt. So expected points added in reality stat here, 28th. Obviously terrible. In success rate, they're even worse. They're 31st. And in boom rate, and again, boom rate with Travis Etienne, one of the top 5 big play backs in the NFL, they're 28th. And so not a great matchup against the Texans defense that is number 4 in yards before contact and number 2 in boom rate. They're going to limit some of those things. And again, you talk about at one point being 10 carries for 10 yards. We saw all of that in this game. The way to have addressed it would have been to get him 10 targets in this one. The Jaguars do still win. I am still confident in both them and the Texans. This is low-key one of the biggest games of the week, biggest games of the season. I've been critical of the AFC South. It's starting to get really exciting. These teams are going to be with us, not just for this season, but they're the rising power division in the AFC. They might end up being the best division in the AFC this year, in part because the AFC North has just been absolutely devastated by key injuries. Colm, this was a cool game.
Yeah, and you mentioned like the landscape over the last 10 years with the improvement of both those franchises, and now, certainly CJ Stroud has kind of put rocket fuel on turning this Texans team into a potential competitor. So exciting to see franchises who maybe haven't had huge success start to move into have those opportunities. The next game, Shawn, we're going to talk about is the Chiefs and the Raiders. And I want to mention this because we like to joke about Pacheco and his high knees and stuff like that. Isaiah Pacheco over the last couple of weeks has had some of his best performances for the Chiefs. This was a contest 31-17, pretty close throughout, 14-14 at the half. The Chiefs just paring away towards the end. But the two players I want to talk about, one is Pacheco, 15 for 55 on the ground with 2 rushing touchdowns. He also has 5 targets, 5 receptions for 34 yards. The other player, Shawn, that we've been looking for, kind of, if you can call it a breakout, this game we wanted him to have more targets, more usage. We get 10 targets for Rashee Rice, 8 for 107 and a touchdown, 39 being his longest reception of the contest. He does have a drop in this game where he should make the reception. He has another one where it's kind of down, kind of almost at his feet, which is I think is a difficult catch for Rice, and they were the 2 incompletions in this contest. But Rice, I thought, looked great outside of those 2 potential plays that I mentioned there, and then we also get Pacheco getting in the end zone twice. What were your thoughts on this Chiefs performance? A little bit more concentrated in terms of the targets and opportunities around. We get 10 targets for Rice, 7 for Kelsey, and then it's 5 for Pacheco. So not as spread out as it has been in the past when they're trying to target a multitude of players who shouldn't really be receiving targets. The other note, just on the other side, before I let you talk about the Chiefs, is Jacoby Myers continues to impress me. 7 targets, 6 receptions, 79 yards, and a touchdown. We also get 7 targets, 5 receptions, 73 for Devontae Adams. But Josh Jacobs, it looked like was on his way to a pretty big day in this one. He has a good day, but he has a 63-yard rushing touchdown in it, which is in the first half. Looks like things are going to kick off in a big way. 20 for 110 is where he finishes up. So very inefficient beyond the 63-yard rushing touchdown, which is obviously a massive piece of efficiency there. But what was your thoughts, Shawn, more so on the Chiefs side of this game?
We talk about those heartbreaking plays, and sometimes the heartbreaking play is one that is so bland that it hardly seems like anything. And even then, at the time, that's going to be the one that costs you. When Clyde Edwards-Helaire gets that goal line carry from the 1-yard line, and this is after he got a carry from the 6 where he looked decent and punches it from the 6 down to the 1. He gets that goal line carry from the 1, and you're saying, get in, because if he doesn't, Pacheco is going to come in and get the score on the next play, which he does do. That play, the other one I think that's going to keep Blair and me out of the playoffs, sadly. He looked good. It's, again, another game where he averages less than 4 yards per attempt. It's a game where you're a little bit frustrated that he's the one drawing the targets, although he was efficient in the passing game here. The Chiefs are another one of these kind of interesting teams where it's so frustrating when you watch what they do, because they're being given this amazing gift on offense and they can't take advantage of it because of the quality of their running backs. You look at the Kansas City Chiefs, and they rank number 4 overall coming into this game in yards before contact, over 2 yards. And despite that, because they don't have talented backs, they're 24th in success rate. And so defenses are being able to exploit the Chiefs' lack of ability to punish them in the running game because of the talent that they have there. And so we'll see if this allows them to turn any type of corner. the main thing that you mentioned there is that they were more concentrated, and it feels like that's the solution. Now, partly we have to be skeptical of simply having the things that we want to have happen as fantasy managers and believing that that is actually a reality fix. But if the Chiefs have a way to turn this season around on offense, it requires the emergence of a receiver who can get the job done. And that almost has to be Rashee Rice. He's the guy that they drafted. He's a player who came in with good stats. And this is one of the things we talked about during prospect season using the great data from Sports Info Solutions. That's part of our prospect evaluation series. Someone who was good underneath, someone who was good down the field, brings sort of a hybrid receiving profile. And that's not to say that he's refined as a route runner, because you're looking at different things in college than what the Chiefs are asking you to do at the NFL level. And yet, knowing that you have multiple parts of your portfolio and that you have the athleticism to be a difference maker, and you saw that on the 39-yard touchdown, right? The run after the catch there is not extraordinary, but very, very impressive. Should have been tackled. You could argue the same thing for the Josh Jacobs touchdown, that if the defense does what they should do, neither of these touchdowns happen. But in both cases, because of the skill, the talent, the explosiveness of the offensive player, you get a touchdown that maybe shouldn't happen. And for the Chiefs especially, leaning into the guy who can actually do that is very valuable. This is a game where MVS goes down to a single target. We talked about last week the drop, the fact that on 3 targets he has 0 receptions. This week, MVS actually manages to have even fewer receiving yards. He drops down to -1. But -1 on simply 1 target is better than what we have been getting. Justin Watson, who's looked pretty good, only gets the 3 targets. For those guys to combine for 4 targets and Rashee Rice to get 10, for Travis Kelce to actually still not be that involved, but make the most of his 7, that's the direction the Chiefs offense has to go. And it came at a crucial point, because you talk about how this game was close sort of in the middle, but the Chiefs scored 31 of the last 34 points in this game. At one point, they were in real danger to falling to this resurgent Las Vegas Raiders team. Now, we have to be a little bit careful of that, because we do know that 2 of those victories come against the New York Giants and the New York Jets, 2 of the very weakest teams in the NFL, but they dominate the first quarter of this game. They get up 14-0. And when they get that second score, finally we see Patrick Mahomes looking like Patrick Mahomes and leading a 12-play, 71-yard touchdown drive. That could be the drive that defines the entire season for the Kansas City Chiefs.
We'll see what happens. I was happy to see it be more condensed or concentrated than it has been in the past. Shawn, let's talk about a couple of games here as we get ready to wrap things up. We're talking running backs, so we'll stick with that theme. Another running back that is on that main event team that we talked about earlier that helped us quite a bit this week was Rhamondre Stevenson, and the Patriots lost to the New York Giants. This game was pretty ugly throughout. You and Ben were talking about, how this could have went to overtime, and did the Patriots wanted to go to overtime with their current 2-9 record and maybe their hope for very high draft capital in 2024's NFL draft. But the New York Giants win. They are 4-8 on the season. Tommy DeVito gets another win in this one. Jalin Hyatt has a really nice day from this in terms of how their offense worked. He had 109 total yards, led the offense by quite a considerable way. 6 targets, 5 receptions, the longest of those being 41. A really impressive performance by Hyatt in this contest. But on the Patriots side, it really is Rhamondre Stevenson and not a lot else. We do get Demario Douglas with 6 receptions for 49 yards. We get Devontae Parker 3 for 42, but nothing else really to get excited about. But Stevenson, 21 carries, 98 yards rushing, 1 touchdown. Also goes with 5 receptions on 5 targets for 9 yards, which isn't all that impressive. But we do see him really start to take control of this backfield with Siegele Elliott in there as well. He had 9 for 46 on the ground, also has 2 targets for 6 yards. I think it's a bit like we talked about with Elliott, but what Stevenson has done recently over the past couple of weeks in an offense which continues to struggle mightily in terms of Mac Jones starts this game, has 21 pass attempts, completes 12 of them, 2 interceptions, gets benched. Bailey Zappi comes in 9 of 14 for 54 yards and 1 interception. I think Stevenson's doing a lot in a very tough situation. The one thing with it, we obviously seen the explosive run a couple of weeks ago with the longest rush here, 15 yards, which is quite consistent in terms of he is picking up the yardage, but there's just not the hugely explosive plays in there with it. But what are your takeaways? Are you going the Hyatt route here, Shawn, or are you going to talk about Stevenson? Which way do you want to go?
We've mentioned Stevenson as a buy low really for the last 3 weeks. And fortunately, that has been working out. I don't think that everything is solved here. You look at how bad the Patriots passing attack is, and your hope in a couple of these games when you have a back like a Stevenson is that he's going to break through from multiple touchdowns. And yet right now the risk to even get a single touchdown is so extreme. He does score in this game. He looks good when they get down there in the red zone, and you just need more of those opportunities to really realistically get the points that will work. I go back again to Blair's article. So many fun notes in this every week, but this was a battle between the Patriots rushing attack that ranked number 32 and dead last in boom rate generated versus the New York Giants rushing defense that ranked number 32 and dead last in boom rate allowed. So this is a kind of fun one. I would argue that Stevenson does win the battle here, if you can call it that, even though
he won the battle, but the Giants won the war. They
did. And you mentioned Jalin Hyatt. He's somebody who is just so much fun because the New York Giants quarterbacks, and really you can go to any of them this season, have been so lackluster and overmatched by everything else that's going on. You haven't been able to get that development through the course of the season for two of our favorite guys in Wan'Dale Robinson and Jalin Hyatt, who, fortunately, and from a vaguely exciting perspective, as you think about the long term, as you think about dynasty, these are the two guys who lead in targets in this game. Now it's only 6 for Hyatt, 5 for Robinson. If the quarterbacks had stayed healthy and the defense hadn't been so bad that we obviously are hearing all of these rumors about the defensive coordinator getting fired, if the team hadn't just gotten swarmed under in so many games, then you're looking at a squad where Jalin Hyatt and Wan'Dale Robinson coming off the injury, so you have a rookie and an injured player, they would have developed into, I wouldn't say elite, but an impressive 1-2 punch that would make this Giants offense very interesting. You think about some of the things that Zay Flowers has done as an undersized wide receiver, some of the things that Josh Downs has done as an undersized wide receiver. I still believe that Jalin Hyatt is probably the most talented of those 3 players, slightly different profiles for each. That's not to say that he's going to be the best player, because you're going to have better quarterback play than you can really, squint and see in the, short or even intermediate term for the Giants to have that fully manifest. And yet, your best window to buy Hyatt would have been before this game. But as the next 6-7 weeks go along, you go into the offseason, the numbers probably over that stretch are not great. And Hyatt is one of these guys who's sticking in the middle to back of rosters. He's someone who can be acquired as a throw-in in a 2-for-2 or 2-for-3 or 3-for-3, some type of creative and complicated trade. You want to add Hyatt to the back of as many rosters as you can during the offseason once this game is a little bit more lost to the fantasy manager. Once it's not so fresh in the memory, you want to keep it there. You want to remember this performance because he was beating the New England defensive backs absolutely at will. And when you have a multi-level threat in Hyatt and a speed threat in Hyatt, he's somebody who could really emerge as, I'd say, a borderline star 2 or 3 years from now. Because of the trajectory of the team, it's going to be a slow burn. It's going to be a slow build, I believe, for Hyatt. And yet the ultimate upside is very, very impressive.
The final note on Stevenson in this one, I mentioned getting more of the backfield share there. He had a season high 78% of snaps in this one, and also had 70% of the running back rush share for the first time since week 4. So let's see how that manifests itself here as we move forward. The last game, Shawn, to talk about today is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Indianapolis Colts. The Colts get the win. They go to 6-5. The Bucs now 4-7, 27-20. We have talked in the recent weeks about Rachaad White and the work he's been doing in the passing game. Today, he was kind of phased out of the passing game, just at 6.7% target share, his lowest since week 1. but he did have 15 carries for 100 yards, a long of 38 on that. So looked a lot more impressive in the running game today than he had, and kind of flipped the script a little bit there. We had Mike Evans, Shawn, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 70 yards, 2 touchdowns going his way. On the flip side, we're talking about condensed offenses. Michael Pittman, Josh Downs combined for 26 targets, 13 apiece in this one. Pittman, though, turning it into a much more productive day, 10 for 107 for him, 5 for 43 for Downs, who, as a rookie, continues to look good. You mentioned him, obviously, a moment ago there. Jonathan Taylor, 15 for 91 and 2 touchdowns for him on the ground. Nothing in the passing game, not even a single target going his way. How are you feeling about Taylor now as we move forward here? Another productive day for him. Unfortunately, nothing in the passing game, but interesting to see some of the higher end players in this have very productive fantasy days.
This was one where at certain points you were wondering if a Taylor injury was somehow factoring in, because he'd gotten so much of the work over the last several weeks. And then for a decent stretch in the middle of this game where the outcome is very much in doubt, you get the Colts going to Zach Moss, and Zach Moss looks pretty good, right? He gets the 8 carries. He averages almost 7 yards per attempt. He gets the 3 targets. This is a move back in the direction that for Taylor managers can be potentially devastating. And yet Taylor continued to demonstrate his big play ability, his ability to get in for touchdowns. You get the 2 scores. That's really what you're looking for with Taylor in this offense. It's a multi-touchdown type of game. If he gets 5 more carries, you feel like he's also going to break a long one. You'd love to see a couple of receptions. Overall, an impressive performance from the Colts in that they gave 41 passing attempts to Gardner Minshew. You get the 13 targets for Michael Pittman, the 13 targets for Joshua Downs. And a little bit of that, you're wondering if it's the best use of the resources when you have a Jonathan Taylor. But because the Colts were able to set this up by throwing to force the Bucs to respect their approach, and then you're running off of that, as opposed to what the Lions came out and did in several situations where they're trying to, again, establish the run, right? You have a game here where the 2 backs carry 23 times between them for almost 150 yards. And this is very noteworthy in that, this Buccaneers team simply cannot be run on. They were number 1 in boom rate. They were top 5 in EPA per rush attempt, yards after contact per attempt, and they were number 1 in rushing fantasy points over expectation coming into this game. This is a game where you would expect Pittman and Downs to get huge target numbers, to move the ball successfully through the air. Very impressed again with the Colts coaching staff, with that one caveat of really wanting Taylor to be more involved, because Jonathan Taylor is such a unique talent. Taking him off the field doesn't seem like the best use of your resources.
It doesn't. Shawn, we tend to talk quite a bit about teams not using the best of their resources. Let's hope that over these current weeks, as we move forward into the playoffs, that all those resources are fully used and we see lots of fantasy points scored. But I know there's listeners out there looking for either lots of points or 0 points, a bit like ourselves, Shawn, and including your situations for a number of teams on Monday Night Football. So if you are watching along, if you have some stakes involved in the game, hopefully you'll enjoy it. If not, hopefully your team is set up for playoff success. But a fun show. Enjoy talking through the games with Shawn. We'll be back with our second show of the week, which, as I always mention on these shows, comes out on Wednesday. Sometimes it sneaks out on Tuesday afternoon. So make sure you're subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get those once they are available. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OvertimeIreland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back,